You've probably seen the pictures. A woman in an elaborate silk dress standing beside a steam locomotive. A gentleman in a top hat reading a newspaper on a cobblestone street. Gas lamps glowing gold through the evening fog. Department stores with gilded windows. Telegraphs connecting cities. Photographs. Newspapers. Police forces. Courts of law. A functioning government. A queen on the throne for 63 years. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, looks, at first glance, like the beginning of the world we recognize. And that is precisely the most dangerous thing about it. Because the Middle Ages, that's easy to fear. You see a man in a mud hut drinking out of a wooden bowl, and you think, yeah, I wouldn't last a week. But the Victorian era is different. It pulls you in with its tailored coats and its brick townhouses, and its sense of order and civilization, and then, quietly, it destroys you. Not with a sword, not with a plague cart rolling through the village. It destroys you with your breakfast, with the wallpaper in your bedroom, with the fog you breathe before you've even had a chance to think about running back to the 21st century. This is not the romantic era of Sherlock Holmes solving mysteries in a firelit Baker Street apartment. This is not the graceful world of Pride and Prejudice afternoon teas and polite conversation. Those images were created by the wealthy, for the wealthy, and they describe the experience of perhaps 3% of the population. The other 97%? They were living through something that would break a modern human being within hours. Not days. Hours. So let's do this properly. Let's walk through your first 24 hours in the Victorian era. And let's be honest about every single moment of it. Because by the time the sun sets on your first day, if you're even still standing, you will understand something that no history book ever really captures. You will understand that the people who survived this era, the ordinary working people who lived and breathed and raised children in these conditions, were not just tough. They were something close to superhuman. And you, with your filtered water and your central heating, and your antibiotic prescriptions waiting at the pharmacy, are nowhere near ready for what they faced. Let's start at the very beginning. Before you even open your eyes on your first Victorian morning, before you take a single step or speak a single word, the era has already begun its work on you. It starts with the air. You wake up somewhere around 1880. Let's say London, because London is the heart of it all, the capital of the most powerful empire on earth. The city that the Victorians themselves held up as proof that humanity had reached its highest point. And the first thing that hits you, before the sounds, before the cold, before anything else, is the smell. It is not like any smell you have encountered before. It is not the pleasant wood smoke of a campfire. It is not the sharp, clean scent of a winter morning. It is a thick, yellowish, sulfurous assault on your lungs that arrives with an almost physical weight. By 1880, London is burning roughly 11 million tons of coal every single year. Every home, every factory, every bakery, tannery, brewery, and railway engine. Coal, coal, and more coal, all of it pumping sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, soot particles, and a cocktail of toxic byproducts directly into the air of a city home to 4.5 million people. On clear days, the pollution is merely alarming. On bad days, it becomes what the Victorians called a pea super, and that name is not poetic exaggeration. The fog that settles over London in the coldest months is not ordinary fog. It is a mixture of natural moisture and coal smoke, so thick and so yellow-green that visibility drops to a few feet. Street lamps become blurry orange orbs. People tie handkerchiefs over their faces and still end up coughing black into the fabric by midday. In the worst events, horses pulling carriages fall down in the streets because they cannot see the road ahead of them. In the winter of 1880, a single fog event is estimated to have killed somewhere between 700 and 1,200 people directly. That is not the death toll from a war or a disaster. That is the death toll from breathing the air on a foggy week in the capital of the most advanced civilization on Earth. The victims are primarily the elderly, the very young, and anyone who already has lung problems, which in a city full of factory workers and coal miners and tannery workers means a very large portion of the population. But here is the thing that history tends to gloss over. You do not have to die in a pea souper to be destroyed by Victorian air. The chronic low-level damage being done to lungs across the industrial cities of England every single day is staggering. Chronic bronchitis is so common among the working population that it has its own nickname. They call it the Manchester disease, or in some circles simply the English disease. A persistent, rattling, productive cough is not considered a medical problem in Victorian England. It is simply how people breathe. It is the background soundtrack of city life. Coal is not the only contributor. London in 1880 is also home to roughly 300,000 horses. 300,000 animals eating, drinking, sweating and producing roughly 22 pounds of manure per horse per day. Do that math for a moment. That is 3,000 tons of horse dung deposited on the streets of London every single day, drying in the summer sun, grinding to a fine powder under iron-wheeled carriages, and rising in clouds of particulate matter that you breathe in with every step you take. The Victorians have street cleaners called crossing sweepers, many of them children, whose entire job is to clear paths through the manure so that pedestrians can cross the road without sinking into it. Before you have eaten a single meal or drunk a single drop of water on your first Victorian morning, your lungs have already begun taking damage that modern medicine would take years to repair. But you are thirsty, of course you are. So let's talk about water. If you are wealthy, you might have access to one of the private water companies that service certain neighbourhoods of Victorian London. The New River Company, the Chelsea Waterworks, the East London Water Company. These companies pipe water directly from the Thames or from various reservoirs into your home, perhaps even to a tap inside the building itself. This sounds like progress. And it is, compared to what came before. The problem is that the Thames by 1850 is not a river in any sense that a modern person would recognize. It is an open sewer. For most of the Victorian era, London has no centralized sewage system. Human waste from the city's approximately 2 million cesspools and privies leaches directly into the ground, and from there into the Thames, the same river from which the water companies are pumping drinking water. The same river along whose banks children play and fishermen cast their lines and laundry is washed. By 1855, the Thames contains over 200 tons of organic matter per day, almost all of it sewage. In the summer of 1858, things reach a crisis point that enters the history books as the Great Stink. A particularly hot summer causes the organic matter in the Thames to decompose so rapidly and so completely that the smell becomes physically unbearable within half a mile of the riverbanks. The curtains of the Houses of Parliament, which sit directly on the Thames, are soaked in chloride of lime in a desperate attempt to neutralize the odor enough to allow parliamentary business to continue. Members of Parliament gag and flee their chambers. The smell of the river is strong enough to stop a nation's government in its tracks. Cholera does not stop for anyone. Between 1831 and 1866, London is struck by 4 major cholera epidemics. The 1848 to 1849 epidemic kills more than 14,000 people in the capital alone. The 1853 to 1854 epidemic kills another 10,000. These are not ancient history numbers from a distant era. These are deaths happening in a city with electric telegraph and photography and steam-powered printing presses. A city that considers itself the pinnacle of human civilization. A physician named John Snow suspects, ahead of his time, that cholera is spread through contaminated water rather than through the miasma, the bad air, that most Victorian doctors blame for disease. In 1854, during an outbreak centered on a neighborhood called Soho, he maps the cases and traces them to a single water pump on Broad Street. He convinces local officials to remove the handle from the pump, ending that particular outbreak. Snow's work is a genuine triumph of observational science. But here is the part that tells you everything you need to know about Victorian medical culture. Even after Snow publishes his findings, even after the evidence is laid out clearly, the majority of the medical establishment refuses to believe him for another decade. The official position remains that cholera is caused by bad air. People keep dying. The pump handle stays off, but the underlying system remains unchanged. If you are not wealthy enough for a private water connection, your water comes from a public standpipe, or from water carriers who fill barrels from the river and deliver them door to door. In 1850, a detailed survey of working-class districts in London finds that in some neighbourhoods, a single standpipe serves 2,000 people, open only a few hours per day. You wait in line with your bucket, you fill what you can, and you take it home and use it for cooking, drinking, washing clothes, and every other purpose water serves. By the time your water reaches your lips on a good day, it has already had an interesting journey. On a bad day, it is carrying Vibrio cholerae at concentrations sufficient to kill you within 48 hours. If you are living anywhere outside London, particularly in the industrial north, in Manchester or Sheffield or Leeds or Birmingham, the picture is no better and in many cases considerably worse. Manchester's water supply in the 1840s is drawn from rivers already loaded with industrial runoff from dye works, bleach factories and slaughterhouses upstream. Edwin Chadwick, a Victorian social reformer whose 1842 report on the sanitary conditions of the labouring population is one of the most disturbing documents in British history, finds that the average life expectancy at birth for a labouring class person in Manchester is 28 years. 28 years. Not because people are being killed by swords or swallowed by plague, because of the water they drink and the air they breathe and the food they eat every single day. Speaking of which, let's eat. You have survived the air and the water long enough to need breakfast, and your first Victorian meal is going to be a remarkable education in the gap between what food looks like and what food actually is. In the years before 1860, and to a significant degree for decades after, the food supply of Victorian England is almost completely unregulated. There is no Food and Drug Administration. There is no food safety inspection. There is no legal requirement for any ingredient to be disclosed on any label, because there are barely any labels. What there is instead is a food industry operating on pure commercial self-interest, with no consequences whatsoever for poisoning its customers, as long as nobody could prove it. The results are extraordinary. Bread, the staple food of the working class, is routinely adulterated with alum, which is aluminum potassium sulfate. Bakers add it because alum makes bread whiter, fluffier looking, and heavier, which means they can use less actual flour and still sell a loaf that looks the same size. The effect of regularly consuming alum is cumulative damage to the digestive system and interference with the body's absorption of nutrients. For a working-class family already on the edge of malnutrition, this is not a minor inconvenience. It is the difference between a body that can fight off illness and one that cannot. Milk is watered down so routinely that undiluted milk is actually rare enough to be notable. But watering down milk is merely dishonest. The more dangerous practice is adding chalk, or in some cases plaster of Paris, to restore the white color after dilution. And beyond chalk, milk is frequently delivered in containers that have not been properly cleaned, from cows that have not been inspected, transported through streets in the same horse-drawn carts that pass through sewage-covered roads, and served to children whose immune systems are already struggling. Beer is adulterated with everything from salt to copperas, which is iron sulfate, to the plant extract Nux vomica, which contains strychnine, added because strychnine in small doses mimics the bitterness of hops and therefore stretches the actual hop supply. There are Victorian pub-goers who are receiving micro-doses of strychnine with every pint, wondering why their ale seems to have an interesting kick to it. Tea, which by the Victorian era has become the national drink of England at every class level, is cut with dried hedge clippings, sawdust dyed black, and spent tea leaves that have been dried, re-rolled, and sometimes colored with lead chromate or Prussian blue dye to make them look like fresh leaves. A Parliamentary Select Committee investigation in 1855 finds that of the tea samples it tests, more than half are adulterated. Sweets and confectionery aimed at children are where Victorian food adulteration reaches its most horrifying expression. The colors that make candy attractive, the bright reds and yellows and greens, are in many cases lead chromate, vermilion containing mercury, and copper arsenite. These are not trace contaminations. These are intentional ingredients chosen for their visual effect, with no consideration whatsoever for the people eating them. In 1858, in the city of Bradford in Yorkshire, A confectioner's assistant goes to collect a batch of daft, which is the harmless inert filler, plaster of Paris or powdered gypsum that is routinely used to bulk out peppermint lozenges. The warehouse keeper gives him, by mistake, arsenic trioxide. The assistant does not know the difference. He takes the arsenic back to the confectioner. The lozenges are made with the usual recipe, and they are sold at the local market. 200 people are poisoned. 20 die, most of them children. The Bradford Sweets poisoning, as it comes to be known, is not a freak accident. It is the logical endpoint of a food system in which nobody is checking anything and nobody is accountable for anything. Even your kitchen itself is working against you. Before refrigeration becomes available and affordable, which does not happen for most working-class households until the 20th century, keeping food fresh is a constant battle. Meat sits in rooms that are rarely below 60 degrees Fahrenheit during summer months. Fish arrives days old in inland cities. Dairy spoils within hours on a warm day. The options are salt, smoke, vinegar pickling, and hope, applied in varying combinations. Food poisoning is not a medical emergency in the Victorian era. It is a regular, expected, seasonal occurrence that people simply endure or die from, depending on their underlying health. If you are still standing after your first Victorian meal, you will want to consider your health, because something is almost certainly going wrong with it by now. Victorian medicine is one of those subjects that requires you to hold two contradictory truths in your head at the same time. On one hand, the Victorian era produces genuine world-changing advances in medical knowledge. Anesthesia arrives in the 1840s, with ether first used successfully in surgery in 1846, and chloroform following shortly after. Germ theory is validated and accepted over the course of the 1860s and 1870s, largely through the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Joseph Lister introduces antiseptic surgical techniques with carbolic acid in 1867, dramatically reducing post-surgical infection rates. By the end of the Victorian era, medicine is genuinely beginning to resemble something we might recognize. On the other hand, these advances happen gradually across decades. They are adopted unevenly and reluctantly by practitioners who have spent their careers doing things a different way. And for the vast majority of the Victorian period, if you get sick, the tools available to treat you are somewhere between useless and actively dangerous. Before germ theory is widely accepted and practiced, which does not really happen in most hospitals until the 1880s at the earliest, surgeons do not wash their hands between patients. They operate in their street clothes, sometimes proudly wearing coats stiffened with old blood as a sign of their experience. Surgical instruments are not sterilized. The rate of death from post-surgical infection, called surgical fever, is high enough that in many hospitals in the 1850s, having surgery is statistically more likely to kill you from infection than from the condition it is meant to treat. There is a reason the Victorians have a saying about going to hospital as a last resort. The hospital is where you go when you have already decided you are probably going to die. Laudanum is sold freely over the counter at every chemist in England for the entire Victorian period. Laudanum is a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, and it is the painkiller, the cough remedy, the anxiety treatment, the sleep aid, and the infant soother of the Victorian age. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed specifically for teething babies, contains 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce. Mothers dose their infants with it every night without the faintest idea that they are giving their children an opioid. Chemists sell it to adults with no prescription, no dosage guidance, and no warning. Addiction to laudanum is widespread, mostly unremarked upon, unless it becomes dramatic enough to interfere with respectable life. And deaths from accidental overdose are common enough to warrant their own census category. Patent medicines, the Victorian era equivalent of wellness supplements, are a pharmaceutical Wild West. Cocaine tooth drops are sold for children's toothaches. Arsenic complexion wafers are marketed to women who want clearer skin, the theory being that small doses of arsenic improve the complexion, which is true in the same way that standing in front of a mild heat source warms you up before eventually burning you. Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company that will later become famous for aspirin, markets heroin as a non-addictive substitute for morphine starting in 1898. The name heroin comes from the German heroisch, meaning heroic, because of the sense of strength and well-being that users report. It is sold as a cough suppressant and a treatment for children's croup. Mercury is prescribed throughout much of the Victorian period for syphilis, which, given the social and sanitary conditions of the era, is epidemic in urban populations. Mercury treatment does not cure syphilis. What it does is cause the teeth to loosen and fall out, damage the kidneys and the nervous system, cause the gums to recede painfully, and produce tremors and neurological symptoms that in many cases are worse than the disease being treated. Patients who begin mercury treatment for syphilis often find themselves with the worst of both worlds, the ongoing progression of the disease and the mounting damage from the cure. Dentistry deserves its own moment of attention. Your teeth in the Victorian era are a countdown clock. Without fluoride toothpaste, without sugar-free options, without proper dental hygiene education, without affordable dental care, tooth decay advances rapidly and relentlessly. The available treatment options are, for most of the Victorian period, limited to extraction. There is no Novocaine. Early in the era, there is no anesthesia of any kind for dental procedures. You sit down, the barber surgeon grips the offending tooth with a pair of pliers-like forceps called a dental key, and you scream while he removes it. If you are wealthy enough to be receiving dental care by the second half of the Victorian period, you may be offered chloroform to make you unconscious, which is better, though it carries its own risks of death from dosing errors. The replacement teeth, if you choose to replace them, are often human teeth. The Victorian tooth trade is a bustling commerce in which the teeth of the poor are extracted during their lifetimes and sold, or in which teeth are removed from fresh corpses, particularly after large battles, and supplied to dentists who install them in the mouths of the wealthy. The teeth taken from soldiers killed at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 are traded for decades afterward and are still appearing in dental offices well into the Victorian era, marketed with the grim glamour of a brand name, Waterloo teeth. But let's say you have avoided all of that so far. You have breathed the coal smoke and the horse manure fog, and you are still breathing. You have drunk the Thames water and survived the first wave of cholera symptoms. You have eaten the alum bread and the mercury-colored candy, and your digestive system is registering its objection, but you are still upright. Now it is time to go to work. Because if you are living in Victorian England, and you are not among that tiny fraction at the top of the social pyramid, you are going to work. The working conditions of the Victorian era are a subject that even people with a passing knowledge of history tend to underestimate. We know broadly that it was harsh. We know about child labor and long hours. But the lived reality of working-class labor in the first half of the Victorian period is something that reaches beyond the concept of hardship into a kind of sustained, industrial-scale human damage that has very few parallels in modern experience. Before the Factory Acts begin to be meaningfully enforced in the 1840s and 1850s, the working day in a textile mill or a pottery works or a glass-blowing factory is commonly between 12 and 16 hours. 6 days per week, with a brief pause for meals if the employer is generous, or with no pause at all if the employer is not. The machinery in these factories does not have safety guards. Drive shafts run at head height, looms and spinning frames catch loose clothing and hair. Workers who are tired, which after 14 hours of standing and repetitive motion is all of them, make mistakes. The accident rate in Victorian factories is high enough that almost every working-class family in an industrial city has a member who has lost a finger, a hand, an eye, or worse. In the coal mines, the situation is different in character but not in severity. The Mines Act of 1842 bans women and children under 10 from working underground, which tells you immediately what was happening before 1842. Children as young as 5 were employed as trappers, sitting alone in the dark for 12-hour shifts, opening and closing ventilation doors to regulate the airflow through the mine. They sat in perfect darkness, except when a miner passed through with a lamp, for 12 hours, often alone. A 5-year-old child, sitting in darkness in a coal mine, opening and closing a door. The hazards of underground coal mining in the Victorian era are constant and numerous. Methane gas, called fire damp, accumulates in pockets and can be ignited by the open flame of a miner's lamp, producing explosions that kill dozens or hundreds at a time. Coal dust explosions are a separate and additional risk. Roof collapses, flooding, and the slow accumulation of coal dust in the lungs that produces black lung disease, which the Victorians call miner's asthma, and which eventually, over years or decades, suffocates its victims as surely as drowning. But the single most viscerally horrifying occupational hazard of the Victorian era belongs not to the mines, but to the match factories, and to a condition called phossy jaw. White phosphorus match manufacturing becomes a major industry in the Victorian era. The process is simple, profitable, and lethal. White phosphorus ignites at room temperature, making it ideal for safety matches that strike on any surface. It also, when inhaled as vapor over months and years, causes a specific and catastrophic destruction of the jaw. The phosphorus accumulates in the jawbone, where it kills the tissue from the inside out. The jaw begins to soften, to swell with abscesses, and in the advanced stages, to glow a greenish white in the dark, the phosphorus decay rendering the bone visibly luminescent. Without surgical intervention, which means jaw removal with no guarantee of survival, the infection spreads to the brain and the victim dies. The surgery itself is nearly always disfiguring beyond recognition. The matchgirls of Bryant and May's factory in London's East End, mostly young women and girls, are exposed to white phosphorus fumes every working day. The company is aware of the hazard. European countries have already begun banning white phosphorus in match manufacturing. Bryant and May continues. In 1888, the matchgirls go on strike in one of the first major industrial actions by women workers in British history. They win improved conditions, though the white phosphorus is not fully banned in Britain until 1910. Hundreds of workers are permanently disfigured or killed in the meantime. You go home after your first Victorian workday, if you survive it, to a home that is, in itself, a threat. If you are working class, and statistically you almost certainly are, your home in any Victorian industrial city is a place that will be difficult to describe to someone who has only experienced modern housing. Not because there is no shelter, there is shelter of a kind. But the density, the darkness, and the intimate sharing of space with disease and death that defines working-class Victorian housing is something that photographs and census records only partly capture. In 1851, a census investigation of working-class housing in London and the major industrial cities finds conditions that Parliament's own investigators describe as incompatible with human health and decency. Entire families, a couple and 6 or 7 children, routinely occupying a single room. Not a single bedroom apartment, a room. One room, perhaps 12 feet by 10 feet, in which the family sleeps, eats, cooks and performs every other function of domestic life. In the worst slum districts, the rookeries of Whitechapel and Bermondsey and St. Giles, the density can be even greater, with 2 or 3 families sharing a single room, and the building itself housing dozens or hundreds of people across its floors and its damp, airless cellar. There is no indoor plumbing in working-class Victorian housing for most of the period. The privy, a wooden or brick outhouse above a cesspool, is shared between multiple families and sometimes between multiple buildings. In the worst overcrowded districts, the ratio might be 1 privy for every 100 or more people. The cesspools, which are legally required to be emptied by night soil men at regular intervals, are in practice often left to overflow when the families cannot afford to pay for emptying. The overflow seeps into the soil, and from there into the shallow groundwater from which many households draw their drinking water from wells. The interior walls of working-class Victorian homes are, in the later decades of the period, increasingly covered in wallpaper. Wallpaper is considered a sign of respectability, an aspiration toward the domestic comfort of the middle class. And here is one of the most extraordinary and darkest details of the entire Victorian era. The most popular shades of green wallpaper, a color that dominates Victorian interior design, achieve their distinctive color through the use of a pigment called Scheele's green, which is copper arsenite, or through a closely related compound called emerald green. Both are arsenic compounds. Both, in the damp conditions of poorly ventilated Victorian rooms, are converted by mold growing on the damp wallpaper paste into trimethylarsine gas, which is released slowly and continuously into the air of the room. Arsenic wallpaper poisoning is responsible for a constellation of Victorian symptoms: fatigue, neurological problems, skin changes, respiratory difficulty, that doctors of the period attribute to a wide variety of other causes and never connect to the green walls of the room. The poisoning is slow, chronic, and cumulative. It is, in a very real sense, the house itself trying to kill you. The name most associated with Victorian wallpaper design is William Morris, whose intricate, botanically inspired patterns became the aesthetic signature of the era and are still reproduced and sold today. Morris's designs, manufactured by his own firm, use Scheele's green and arsenic-based pigments extensively. When concerns about arsenic in wallpaper begin to be raised publicly in the 1870s and 1880s, Morris dismisses them. He insists that the arsenic problem is being manufactured by people he associates with his commercial competitors. He is wrong. The arsenic is real, and it is in his wallpapers, in concentrations that the scientific investigations of the period confirm. Morris's own house in Oxfordshire, Kelmscott Manor, has walls covered in his designs. His health in his later years is poor. He dies in 1896 at the age of 62. His doctor attributes his death partly to having lived and worked in a body that has been doing the work of being Morris, which is a Victorian way of saying that they noticed something was wrong without understanding what it was. Now let's say you are a woman living through this first Victorian day. If everything described so far represents the general experience of a modern person dropped into the Victorian era, the experience of a woman adds several additional layers of danger that are entirely separate from poverty or occupation or location. The Victorian era is, by modern standards, a period in which the legal and medical and social frameworks surrounding women's lives are structured in ways that create specific and compounding risks. You begin with the corset. The Victorian corset is not merely a garment. At its most extreme, worn consistently from adolescence, it is a gradual reshaping of the body that compresses the lower ribs, elevates and constrains the abdominal organs, restricts the lungs' capacity to fully expand, and alters the posture of the spine. Medical literature of the period contains hundreds of case studies of the effects of tight lacing, which is the practice of drawing the corset laces as tight as possible to achieve the smallest possible waist measurement. Fractured ribs are documented. Displacement of the liver, stomach, and intestines downward into the pelvic cavity under years of sustained pressure is documented. Cases of women fainting from the simple exertion of walking upstairs are documented, attributed directly to the constriction of the lungs. Victorian women are not unaware of these risks. There is a robust anti-corset reform movement throughout the period, promoted by dress reformers and some medical voices. But the social pressure on women to conform to the hourglass silhouette that the tight corset produces is enormous. The corset is not just fashion. It is a signal of class and respectability. A woman whose waist is not visibly compressed is read as careless, lower class, or morally suspect. The medical damage is understood and largely accepted as the price of social acceptability. Beyond the corset, the legal framework governing the lives of Victorian women is built on a principle called coverture, which holds that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity is absorbed into that of her husband. She ceases to exist as a separate legal entity. She cannot own property in her own name. She cannot sign contracts. She cannot keep her own earnings, which legally belong to her husband the moment she receives them. She cannot sue or be sued independently. If she is a victim of a crime, including crimes committed by her husband, her legal recourse is limited in ways that have no parallel in modern law. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 makes the first limited steps toward changing this, allowing women to keep some wages and inherit modest amounts of property. The Act of 1882 goes further, finally granting married women full property rights. But for most of the Victorian era, and certainly for the working-class women who have no property to speak of in any case, coverture is simply the background condition of adult female life. Childbirth is the point at which all of these risks converge into a single overwhelming experience. Victorian childbirth takes place at home for almost all but the wealthiest women, conducted by a midwife or, in more prosperous households, a physician. The midwife's medical training varies enormously, from extensive practical knowledge built over decades to essentially none. Hand-washing before delivery is not standard practice until germ theory becomes accepted, which means that the physician's hands moving between patients or from other procedures carry bacteria directly to the birth site. Puerperal fever, an infection of the uterus after childbirth, kills an estimated 5 to 15% of women who develop it, and it is largely preventable by hand-washing, a fact that a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis demonstrates with meticulous statistics in the 1840s, is rejected by the medical establishment, and is not widely adopted until decades after his death. Maternal mortality across Victorian England varies significantly by location and class, but the overall picture is sobering. In the early Victorian period, roughly 5 or 6 women die for every 1,000 deliveries, a rate that does not include deaths from complications in the weeks following birth. That number seems small until you consider that a Victorian woman in the working class might give birth 6, 8, or 10 times in her lifetime, meaning the cumulative risk across her reproductive years is substantial. There are streets in Victorian London where every woman you speak to has lost at least one close friend or relative to childbirth. It is not exceptional tragedy. It is expected grief. If the first Victorian day has given you everything described so far, you might be wondering what the bottom actually looks like. What happens when all of these forces, the poisoned air, and the contaminated water, and the adulterated food, and the dangerous medicine, and the hazardous work, and the arsenic on the walls, and the legal erasure of women, when all of these combine with actual poverty? The answer is the workhouse. The Victorian workhouse is the creation of the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which is itself the product of a particular Victorian ideology holding that poverty is primarily a moral failing, and that the proper response to poverty is to make the alternative to working so unbearable that no rational person would choose it. The architects of the new Poor Law designed the workhouse system explicitly around what they call the principle of less eligibility, meaning that the conditions inside the workhouse must be less comfortable, less dignified, and less appealing than the worst available independent living outside it, so that only the truly desperate will resort to it. They succeed in this goal completely. Entry into the workhouse means surrendering your clothing, your name in most practical respects, your family connections, and what remains of your autonomy. Men, women, and children are separated and housed in different wards, meaning that a family that enters the workhouse together may see each other only at specified intervals. Inmates wear a uniform. They eat in silence. They perform labor that is explicitly designed to be pointless and degrading, breaking stones, grinding corn by hand, picking oakum, which means unraveling old tarred rope fiber by fiber until your fingers bleed, for hours every day. The food is deliberately minimal. The Victorian dietary standards for workhouse inmates, debated in Parliament and prescribed by Poor Law commissioners, are calculated to keep a body alive and working, while providing the least possible pleasure or comfort. Gruel, thin porridge, bread, small amounts of broth. The famous opening of Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, in which the starving orphan boy asks for more gruel and is met with horror and punishment, is not dramatic invention. It is documentary. Dickens researched it. Sanitary conditions in workhouses are among the worst in Victorian England, which, given what we have already established about Victorian England, is a remarkable achievement. Infectious disease spreads through workhouse populations at devastating rates. Typhus, which spreads through body lice, finds ideal conditions in dormitories crowded with malnourished, unwashed people sleeping in close proximity. Cholera and dysentery exploit the inadequate plumbing. The death rates in workhouses during epidemic years are substantially higher than in the surrounding community. The intended deterrent effect works. People will endure extraordinary suffering to avoid the workhouse. Families living on the edge of starvation in conditions that any modern observer would classify as an emergency will refuse workhouse relief and attempt to survive independently precisely because the workhouse is known to be worse. This means that the most vulnerable people in Victorian England are often not in the institution designed to help them, because that institution is deliberately designed to be something they fear. Outside the workhouse, if you are poor in Victorian England, you live in a social structure that is rigid enough to make the modern concept of a safety net seem almost miraculous by contrast. The Victorian class system is not merely snobbery. It is a legal, economic, and cultural architecture that determines where you can live, what jobs you can apply for, who will speak to you, and how, what medical care you can access, whether your children can attend school, and what your old age will look like if you manage to reach it. Social mobility exists in the Victorian era, but it is exceptional and difficult in ways that go beyond individual effort. The barriers are structural. Education beyond basic literacy is expensive and largely unavailable to working-class children. Professional training requires either family connections or the ability to pay for an apprenticeship that working-class families rarely have. The accent you speak with, the neighborhood you live in, the clothes your body has been shaped by since childhood, all of these things mark you in a Victorian social context with an immediacy and permanence that modern people in most Western countries do not experience. By the time you have reached the end of your first Victorian day, having breathed the coal smoke and the horse dung and the factory fumes, having drunk the Thames-adjacent water supply and eaten the alum bread and the arsenic-colored confectionery, having worked 14 hours in conditions that modern safety law would shut down in the first 5 minutes of inspection, having come home to a single room with green arsenic wallpaper and a cesspool in the yard. If you are still standing, you are standing in a different way than you were when you woke up this morning. Something is different, and it is not just the ache in your muscles or the cough beginning to develop in your chest or the low-grade nausea of the alum bread working through your system. What is different is your understanding of the people who did this every day, not just survived this every day, but got up the next morning and did it again. Who raised children in these conditions and loved those children with the full intensity of human emotion and grieved them when they died at the rates they died, and got up the morning after that grief and went back to the factory or the mine or the match-dipping room. Who found pleasures in what pleasures were available, the music hall on Saturday evening, the smell of a clean shirt, the taste of something sweet from the market stall, the company of neighbors in the same shared misery. Who organized and protested and went on strike for incremental improvements that their grandchildren would benefit from, but that they themselves would never see. The Victorian working class builds the infrastructure of the modern world in the literal sense. The sewers that Joseph Bazalgette engineers for London in the 1860s, the system that finally begins to tame the Thames and break the cholera cycle, are dug by hand by labourers working in conditions almost as dangerous as what they're trying to remediate. The railways that connect Victorian England and shorten journey times from days to hours are laid by navvies, migrant labourers with life expectancies so low that the phrase dying like flies becomes associated with railway construction. The textile mills, whose output, clothes and empire are staffed by women and children, whose chronic cough and damaged posture and early arthritis are the physical cost of the fabric that makes Victorian prosperity look so elegant in the photographs. And here's the thing about Victorian photographs. Those sepia images of serious-faced people in formal clothes with perfect stillness before the camera. The stillness is required by the long exposure times of early photography, not by temperament or character. What the stillness hides is everything described in this video. The cough being suppressed for the duration of the exposure, the corset making deep breath impossible, the eye condition from the factory fumes squinting against the light, the missing finger from the machinery accident held behind the back or cropped out of frame. The Victorian era is framed in our cultural memory as a time of order, progress, and empire. And in a limited class-specific sense, it is those things. For a small enough slice of the population, the Victorian era genuinely is an age of comfort and culture and intellectual achievement, with its literature and its science and its art and its engineering. But that slice is small, and its comfort rests directly on the backs and bodies of the much larger population living through the experience described in this video. You would not last 24 hours in the Victorian era, not because you are weak or foolish or unprepared, but because a modern human being, with a modern immune system, calibrated to the relatively clean environments of the 21st century, with no tolerance built up to the specific bacterial load of Victorian drinking water, with lungs never exposed to sustained coal smoke and industrial fumes, with a body never shaped to perform 14 hours of repetitive physical labor, would be brought to genuine crisis by the first day's ordinary experience. Not the dramatic moments, not the cholera epidemic, or the mining disaster, or the factory accident. The ordinary, everyday background conditions of Victorian working life would do it on their own. The remarkable thing, the genuinely astonishing thing, is not that so many Victorians died young. The remarkable thing is how many of them lived. How many of them built lives of meaning and connection, and even beauty within constraints that we can barely imagine. How many of them changed their world enough that the world we inherited is cleaner and safer and longer lived than theirs. The next time you drink a glass of water from the tap, clean and cold and completely safe. The next time you breathe air that is merely imperfect rather than actively toxic. The next time you open a sealed package of food that lists its ingredients and its safety certifications. You are living in a world that is partly the product of Victorian era suffering, of the people who died from the cholera that proved the link between contaminated water and disease, of the match girls who went on strike with phosphorus-rotted jaws to force industrial reform, of the children in the coal mines whose suffering eventually moved Parliament to act, of all the unnamed millions who endured the ordinary horror of Victorian daily life long enough to push the world inch by inch towards something better. They earned our clean water and our safe food and our unpoisoned air with their lives and their bodies and their accumulated irreversible damage. The least we can do is know what it cost them.